and he was in the room, and I was going to go over and say hello, and I didn't do it, and I thought, and I regret it. Of course, he passed away.
Mm-hmm. They were never seen on the red carpet together. No proud fatherly smile, no interviews side by side, only rumors and the heavy silence that surrounded them. For decades, people whispered that Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's most hardened icon, had turned his back on his own son. And when the cameras stopped rolling, no one really knew what kind of father he truly was. But now, at the age of 95, the man who built his legend on grit, control, and silence has finally spoken. Not about a role, not about a movie, but about the one thing he's avoided all his life, the truth about his son. The son he once refused to name, the son he watched from afar, the son who carried his blood, but not his name. What Clint Eastwood confessed has left even his most loyal fans stunned. Because this isn't just a story of a father and son. This is about the shadows that linger behind fame, about how even the toughest cowboys can carry guilt, and how one man's silence became his loudest legacy. And once you know the reason why Clint Eastwood distanced himself from his own son, you'll never see him the same way again. Clint Eastwood wasn't born into fame. He earned every inch of it, with grit under his nails and a stare that could freeze an entire room. From the dusty trails of spaghetti westerns to the chaotic streets of Dirty Harry, he became a symbol not just of American cinema, but of American masculinity itself. Through 6 decades, he built a mythos, a quiet man with a gun, a director with vision, a legend who never looked back. But legends by their nature are built on what's left unsaid. Born in 1930, during the Great Depression, Clint came of age in a world shaped by war and discipline. He didn't speak much on screen or off. He didn't explain himself. And in Hollywood, where image is everything, that silence became his power. Yet behind that stoic facade lay a man with a deeply complicated personal life. Married twice, involved with countless women, at least 8 children, maybe more. Some acknowledged, others hidden, affairs that spanned decades overlapping like unfinished scripts. And amid those layers, a name surfaced that would forever complicate the narrative: Scott Eastwood. Born in 1986 to flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, Scott entered the world under a cloud of secrecy. His birth certificate bore no father's name, just a blank space. A deliberate silence. Clint, still entangled in another public relationship, at the time chose distance, chose discretion, chose denial. Scott wasn't raised in Beverly Hills. He wasn't chauffeured to premieres or gifted easy roles. Instead, he spent his early years in Hawaii, with his mother unaware, or perhaps too aware, of the man the world called a legend, but whom he only knew as an absence. His surname was Reeves, not Eastwood. And while the world watched Clint win Oscars and direct box office hits, Scott was growing up in a parallel reality, one where his father's legacy was more ghost than guidance. By the time Scott moved back to California as a teenager, the gap between them had already hardened. Clint was 56 years older, set in his ways, and wrapped in a public image that couldn't afford to crack. And Scott, determined, rebellious, and carrying the weight of his father's absence, began forging his own path, not as Eastwood's son, but as a man who had something to prove. What followed was a lifetime of subtle rejections, roles auditioned for and never given, phone calls that went unanswered, a family name withheld until it was earned. The distance wasn't just emotional. It was strategic, calculated, intentional. But why? What could cause a father to keep his own blood at arm's length? Was it shame? Fear? Pride? Or perhaps, as Clint would later reveal, it was something far more personal and far more painful. Before Scott Eastwood could carry his father's name, he had to carry its weight. Hollywood has seen its share of nepotism, but Scott refused to be another spoiled son on set. In fact, for years, he wasn't even Scott Eastwood. He was Scott Reeves, a young man auditioning under his mother's last name, deliberately hiding the bloodline that ran through him. Not out of shame, but out of principle. He wanted to earn his place, not inherit it. He parked cars, he worked construction, he hustled his way into small roles, knowing that every casting director who learned the truth would either resent him or expect more. And all the while, Clint Eastwood watched silently from a distance. No favors, no phone calls, no backstage passes. Only the unspoken test: prove yourself or don't bother coming home. Scott auditioned for roles in his father's films, roles he desperately wanted, roles he could have had with a single word from Clint. But he was turned away, rejected. Even when Clint directed American Sniper, Scott came in for the part of Jeff Kyle and walked out empty-handed. The message was clear: legacy doesn't grant you immunity. Not here, not with him. That rejection hurt, but it also fueled him. Instead of shrinking beneath the Eastwood shadow, Scott doubled down. In 2015, he landed a leading role in The Longest Ride, a Nicholas Sparks adaptation that finally allowed him to step into the spotlight. Then came Suicide Squad, the fate of the furious Pacific Rim uprising. The roles grew, the name changed. Suddenly, Scott Eastwood was no longer just a surname, he was a name of his own. But while his star was rising, the questions never stopped. Why had Clint kept him at arm's length for so long? Why the denial, the silence, the refusals? People speculated. Was Clint ashamed of the affair that produced him? Was he trying to protect Scott from the chaos of fame? Or was it something colder, a calculated choice to build a legacy without distractions? In truth, Clint never spoke publicly about Scott until 2002, when his son was already 16. Even then, it was measured, reserved, as if acknowledging him came at a cost. Yet despite the coldness, there was never cruelty. Clint gave Scott something that very few actors ever receive from their parents: the dignity of struggle, the right to fail, the right to fight. To the world, Clint Eastwood was a man of power. But to his son, he was a locked door, and the only way through it was to break it down himself. It's no wonder that when they finally sat side by side for an interview in 2016, it felt like a small miracle. The old cowboy and the rising star, smiling but still guarded, a conversation years overdue. And as the cameras rolled, one thing became painfully obvious. Whatever love existed between them had taken a long, hard road to get there. To the public, Scott Eastwood had it all: a famous name, striking looks, and a Hollywood career on the rise. But behind the charm and the camera flashes was a young man quietly bearing a weight most never saw. The distance from his father wasn't just professional. It left an emotional void, one that no role could fill. In 2016, during a vulnerable interview with GQ Australia, Scott revealed a moment that had haunted him for years. He spoke about a girlfriend who died tragically in a car accident. Her death wasn't just sudden, it was preventable. The airbags in her vehicle had a manufacturing defect. A piece of metal was ejected during the crash, tearing through her spine. Scott lowered his voice and said, "I've never told anybody that." And in that pause, the world glimpsed something: raw grief that had been buried alone, a grief that perhaps no one had helped him carry. He admitted the trauma changed him, made it harder to love, harder to open up. Maybe it wasn't just about losing her. Maybe it was about losing safety, stability, things he never truly had growing up. He had built walls around his pain the same way Clint had built walls around his own past. And when those walls cracked, it didn't explode. It simply sank into silence. People assumed Scott's life was charmed, but what they didn't see were the restless nights, the internal doubts, the auditions he entered with a chip on his shoulder, never quite knowing if he belonged. He had to fight the perception that everything was handed to him while knowing deep down that nothing ever was. Even when the media spoke of a father-son bond, the reality was more nuanced. Clint had given him discipline, yes, work ethic, absolutely, but affection, validation, those were scarce currencies. The public didn't see the phone calls that didn't come. The birthdays quietly ignored the need to succeed, not out of ambition, but out of emotional survival. And yet Scott didn't crumble. He endured. He kept his pain behind a practiced smile. He turned his suffering into drive his grief into grit. But in doing so, he mirrored his father more than he ever intended. There were nights when the rejection hit harder than expected, when Scott questioned if he was only seen as Clint's mistake rather than his legacy. The weight of carrying his father's name came not with pride, but with a burden of earning it. And in the moments when the camera stopped rolling, he admitted that what hurt most wasn't being cast aside professionally. It was the feeling that he had been disowned emotionally long before anyone even knew he existed. But in every story of collapse, there's a flicker of something else, a turn, a reckoning, a quiet choice to survive. And for Scott Eastwood, that moment came not through his father's embrace, but through something far more powerful: the decision to forgive him. At Legends and Secrets, we don't just look at the glitz, we look at the fractures beneath it. And Clint Eastwood's story, especially his role as a father, is one of the most complex we've ever examined. It would be easy to judge him, to point at the blank space on Scott's birth certificate and say he failed, to count the missed birthdays, the withheld roles, the years of silence, and call it abandonment. But Clint Eastwood never lived his life by the world's expectations. He built his career by defying them. Some call it tough love, others emotional negligence. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only way Clint knew how to parent. A man forged by war, raised in a world of men who didn't cry, didn't hug, didn't say, "I'm proud of you." He carried that same stoicism into fatherhood. And Scott, he paid the price. But there's something remarkable about what Scott became, not despite the distance, but through it. He didn't crumble. He didn't lean on the name to skip the line. He faced rejection, grief identity, confusion, and still stood up and said, "I'll make it anyway." Perhaps the greatest legacy Clint Eastwood ever gave his son wasn't a career. It was resilience. And in the end, that may be more valuable than any movie credit. What do you think? Was Clint protecting his son by keeping him at a distance, or simply protecting himself? Was Scott's rise a product of hardship or a testament to inner strength? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because behind every famous name is a story you were never told. There are stories in Hollywood that shimmer with glamour and applause. And then there are the ones whispered behind closed doors, the ones that sting long after the spotlight fades. This was one of them. Clint Eastwood at 95 remains a towering figure, a man who never begged for understanding, a legend who chose silence over spectacle. But behind the steel gaze was a father who for years remained a stranger to his own son. And Scott Eastwood, in carving his own path, didn't just chase fame. He chased identity, closure, maybe even love, not the kind written into movie scripts, but the kind that comes from being seen, being chosen. They may never have had a picture-perfect bond, but what they have now, respect, recognition, a fragile peace, is perhaps more real than anything Hollywood ever offered. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know. And in that quiet knowing, the myth softens. The man behind the legend becomes clearer. Because in the end, even cowboys grow old, even legends look back, and even fathers, no matter how distant, leave echoes in their sons.